Hello again, 102. In this video, we will begin to answer the first question of Chapter 22, The Clash of Cultures, where we will describe the different factors that contributed to the rise of the consumer culture. And one of the big reasons for the changes in the 20s were the spread of transformational technologies, such as automobiles, trucks, tractors, airplanes, radios, movies, electrical appliances, indoor plumbing, ladies and gentlemen, that greatly improved the standard of living for most Americans. At the same time, social and political changes signaled what many people called a new era in American life. And this is the beginning of the world that you live in today. Maybe the technology has changed, but this idea of mass consumption is still around. Also, another disruptive force was a growing public awareness of the scientific discoveries of Einstein in physics and Freud in psychology, findings that undermined many traditional assumptions about God, the universe, and human behavior, while profoundly affecting social and cultural life. Such new ideas and the sweeping social changes that they created, it made what one historian called a nervous generation of Americans, groping for what certainty they could find. Much of the cultural conflict of the 1920s grew out of the tension between rural and urban ways of life. And for the first time, more Americans lived in cities and rural areas after the First World War, the Great War. While urban economies prospered, farmers suffered from the end of the wartime boom in food exports. Europe started growing their own food again, and all that surplus that had been grown in excess, over-cultivation, which will lead to the Dust Bowl, as we'll see, the rural economy is depressed in the 1920s. The Great Depression has already began for the farm community. And this is question 3, This is the forces of modernism will be opposed by the rural or conservative movements that are against many of these Einsteinian and Freudian changes that are going on in American life. This is a new era of consumption. Jobs were plentiful, inflation was low, income rose throughout the decade. The nation's total wealth almost doubled in 10 years. While wage workers enjoyed a 30% increase in income, the sharpest rise in history. And by 1929, the United States had the highest standard of living in the world. And construction, as it usually does in boom times, led the way. And because of that, it will lead to a remarkable growth of other industries. As people will build houses in certain areas, they will have a way to get there because the automobile is now available. And this creates the need for roads, highways, service stations, and motels that stimulated other industries such as steel, concrete, and furniture. Technology also played a key role in the prosperity of the 20s by enabling mass production through the assembly line process pioneered by Henry Ford. During the 20s, industrial production continued, but the dominant aspect of the economy involved the explosion of new consumer goods made available through a national marketplace. That technologies like movies and radios will help to popularize some of these new different consumer goods. And Westinghouse electrical appliances will be emphasized. And some of these different factors, like this beautiful soft glow lamp, this beautiful electric heater, or this other type of heating implement, electric coffee maker, a battery charger, electric iron, a heating pad, a waffle iron to make your waffles with, and most transformable of all, is the electric stove or the electric range, which will now enable you to cook more right in your home. And the question is the home that you have Does this home love you? And now we have the rise of mass culture with a new emphasis on spending, advertising, credit, and most of all, convenience. This is a growing consumer culture, ladies and gentlemen. Urban dominated, which came to dictate much of social life and social status. In a 1920 newspaper editorial insisted that America's first importance to his country is no longer that of citizen, but of consumer. Consumption is a new necessity. During the war, a journalist noted in 1920, we accustomed ourselves to doing without, to buying carefully, remember? All those different ideas of the food administration under Hoover, buying carefully, using economically, but with the close of the war came a reaction against that. A veritable orgy of extravagant buying is going on of all these new different products that we just showed. Reckless spending takes the place of saving. Waste replaces conservation. To keep people buying, executives focus their resources on two crucial innovations: marketing and advertising, to increase consumer demand and new ways for buyers to finance purchases over time, such as the layaway plan, right? You don't have the cash now, no problem, just put it on layaway. And this is the consumer culture defined. It is a society in which mass production and consumption of nationally advertised products comes to dictate much of social life and status. Consumer debt almost tripled during the 20s. Mass advertising, first developed in the late 19th century, grew into a huge enterprise driving the mass production, mass consumption economy. And again, ladies and gentlemen, this is not dictated down from on high. Yes, it is dominated by the Northeast. Yes, it is dominated by Madison Avenue in New York and places like Chicago and Philadelphia and some of the other large metropolitan areas. But there are multiple, not just one. And with this idea of mass production and mass consumption comes the rise of mass culture. Again, this is not some top-down thing. This is a huge phenomenon. Mass advertising and marketing campaigns increasingly led to this. Americans now not only saw and heard the same advertisements and shopped at the same company stores, but they also read the same magazines, listened to the same radio programs, and they watched the same movies. After all, don't you have a radio in your home? Aren't you living the good life? Everybody needs to have a radio, right? Everybody needs to have an auto, right? Aren't you reading Harper's Bazaar or the New Republic magazine? Aren't you watching Charlie Chaplin and his great silent movies like The Tramp or The Kid? He was a huge silent film star. And in 1896, when some of the first movies came out, they were starting to watch them in New York, and by 1924, there were 20,000 movie theaters, the largest of which were called motion picture palaces. And if any of these places in that real estate still exist today, if they weren't destroyed by the urban renewal projects of the 60s and 70s, they are priceless pieces of Americana, like the Riviera Theater in North Tonawanda, New York. And they're showing 700 new silent films a year that use captions to show dialogue, and then below the screen in the pit there would be an orchestra accompanying the dialogue, giving you a little musical background as well. By 1930, most small towns had theaters, and movies had become the nation's chief form of mass entertainment. And movie attendance during the 20s averaged 80 million people a week, more than half the population. Attendance surged even more after 1928 when the talking movies appeared. Americans spent 10 times as much on movies as they did on tickets to baseball and football games. And the radio craze also builds this mass culture. All kinds of people owned radios, and it changed the pattern of everyday life. After dinner, families would gather around the radio to listen to music, speeches, news broadcasts, weather forecasts, and comedy shows. One ad claimed that the radio is your theater, your college, your newspaper, your library. And all kinds of people own this new technology, where all of these mass advertising campaigns can then be promoted. And this will lead to taking it to the era which we will save for part 2, along with the rise of mass spectator sports.